Okay, here I go again. I need to make another confession. For you see, when God had me start writing this sermon series based on the account of creation in Genesis, I was concerned that my faith in the Bible's account of creation would be proven wrong. I hate to admit it, but despite my brave words that God doesn't lie, part of me wasn't completely 100% positive that my belief in the Bible's account of creation could stand up to such a full-on scrutiny like I was going to give it in these sermons. You see, because there are so many Christians nowadays who firmly believe in evolution, this caused me to doubt and wonder, was I right? And these doubts made me worried about whether I would find out evolution with its long ages time frame is actually true. After all, it wasn't just the Christians who believe in evolution, but it was also how during high school my science teachers would explain with these pictures and diagrams that proved how evolution was true. And some would state that because science had now proven evolution to be fact, this meant that the Bible couldn't be trusted. Yet, despite these teachers' best efforts, I had still chosen to believe the biblical account of creation, because to my teenage mind, why would God lie? Unfortunately, I was completely unaware that due to this teaching on evolution and evolutionary statements I would read here, there and everywhere, doubts would keep popping up about whether the Bible's account of creation was true. These doubts kept telling me, can I really trust God to be telling the truth about his creation work in Genesis? And if not, then can I really trust God with the other aspects of his work? In particular, his creation of me. But what makes it even worse is that I hadn't even considered looking at the evolutionary side of the argument to double check which point of view I should believe. I was going on blind faith. My main reason for not checking all the facts was the Hebrew verse, which says, faith, we understand that the universe was created by God's command, so that what is seen has been made from things that are not seen. As I said, I know many Christians whom I love and respect who firmly believe God used evolution to create the world. And so naturally, I had assumed they had done their research, and after looking at both sides of the debate and fully comparing the evidence presented, they had decided that science had shown beyond any shadow of doubt that evolution was fact and therefore the true account of creation. Therefore, during day one, when I had laid my cards on the table, stating that I believed God created the world in just 6 days, I thought perhaps I would be eating humble pie and have to admit that evolution was the means God used to create the world. But when I discovered during my research for these sermons how evolutionary scientists are constantly changing their theories, and how often there was more than one theory going at the same time, and how often those theories had totally opposing viewpoints as to what happened to create the world, and then how some theories were almost identical to the biblical account, except for their long ages explanation that it took billions and billions of years for it to happen, I realized that there was one common thread that all those evolutionary theories had, and that was how they made God out to be a liar. And yet, I have heard time and time again from Christian people justifying their evolutionary stance by stating that God doesn't say how he created the world or the time he took. Well, perhaps I do have a vastly different understanding of time to them, but you see, if someone was telling me about something they did, and then they finished with evening came and then morning, aside from thinking that was a weird way of putting it, I would naturally assume they were talking about a normal day and night. But for me, what was so cool is that even after all my research, that statement at the end of each day still makes perfect sense as being a 24-hour time period. But as I continued researching, going down many rabbit holes, and I started closely looking at exactly what this first chapter of Genesis says, well, not there at the moment, I discovered that I had actually been more heavily influenced by evolutionary thinking. And then, to my dismay, I realized just how much evolutionary thinking had limited my knowledge and understanding about our God and what He is truly capable of. How this subconscious influence from evolutionary thinking was preventing me from fully 100% positively believing what God was saying in Genesis about how He created the universe and the world, and making Him a much smaller and insignificant God for me. I am so glad God had me do this research, as I discovered that not only does God tell us the time He took to create, but God does tell us how. But first, before we look at what God says about how He created, we need to get to the nitty-gritty of the evolutionary thinking that is day 5, the goo to you process. I thought perhaps now I would find something that can clearly and logically show to me that evolution does make sense. I have heard atheists say that God is a figment of man's vivid imagination. Although personally, I think the Israelites would have found it easier to copy the other nations with their lots and lots of small gods in charge of one area, with maybe a boss god in charge of the smaller gods, which in a way was mirroring the way it works in society, the workplace, and all the way down to the family unit. That would have created a lot less angst and made life easier for them with the surrounding nations. So why would they imagine something so completely different to the other nations with this almighty, powerful God who is the one and only God that created literally everything? And as I researched, I have been humbled and ashamed by just how much I have been guilty of putting God in a box by inadvertently allowing evolutionary thinking to remove most of God's impressive display of power and might as we see it in His creation narrative. But I did discover something I thought was interesting about evolutionary scientists. Some of them do have a pretty good imagination. You see, one important evolutionary theory that I was taught in school was how somewhere between 390 and 360 million years ago, creatures from the oceans began to live in shallower waters, and they slowly evolved by experiencing natural selection that shaped their many adaptations to enable them to live and walk on the land. Now, I'm sorry to say, I really didn't stop to think about that, because at the time it seemed vaguely plausible, perhaps. And even though I was told in the same science class that fish cannot live out of water, it didn't cross my mind that this meant the natural selection necessary for a fish to adapt to land living was literally impossible, because the fish would very quickly die when it's outside its watery living environment. Sorry, but no natural selection if you are dead. And why hadn't I thought of this before is sad, really, because I have owned lots of fish. And believe me, if they accidentally get out of the water, they panic big time. They know they will die if they don't quickly get back into the water. And anyone who's owned fish will attest to the complete panic mode they go into. But actually, it's not just fish who have problems out of water. Even crustaceans like crayfish, who can walk underwater, also don't do so well out of water, as I have discovered from experience. You see, there was this one time we had a small lobster who got out. Now, when I discovered the lobster, he was still alive, and not happy about a human touching it and picking it up. I returned it to the tank, where there was this big celebration thing happening with the other fish in the tank. But it still died within half an hour. Even for the short time it had been out of the water, it was far too long for the lobster to continue living, even when it was returned to the safety of its watery home. Now perhaps, assuming it hadn't died, and with lots of vivid imagination, we could imagine the lobster deciding that spending 5 or so minutes out of the water, totally panicking as it fears for its life, was a good thing. And so each day it spends 5 stress-filled minutes out of the tank, and each day gradually increasing the time it spends panicking until it actually adapted to being able to spend its life out of the water. Come on, let's be realistic. Why on earth would fish want to do that? Like, really, who wants to put themselves under that much unnecessary stress and panic? And stop and think about it. Fish don't even think like humans. They exist to eat and to avoid being eaten. They are certainly not interested in improving their life by trying to live on land. And I'm pretty sure my poor lobster was not heading out to check on the world. He was just climbing the rock that a certain person, who will remain nameless, had put too close to the ledge out of the water and had not put the lid back on properly while cleaning the tank. And I'm pretty sure my lobster had not thought about the fact there was no way he could get back into the tank once he fell off the top. Even now, fish living in shallow water will not go beyond the surface except to stick its nose out of the water to breathe. But apparently, according to evolution, us modern humans still carry the evidence of our aquatic past in the way our arms and our legs are attached to our bodies. I must admit, I'm still having trouble putting together how fins and tails, while gradually turning into arms and legs, would still be useful for swimming or walking on land. It would have to be an instant change for them to work effectively. And even evolutionary biologist Daniel Mayers acknowledges that fish have different muscles and bone structure than land animals. So the evolution of fish would have required the change of many different kinds of body parts. And explains how scientists have also bred fish with special proteins in their muscles that gives off red or green light when seen under a special light, and then performed surgery where they took the pectoral muscle tissue and replaced the muscle to see if the replaced tissue would create pectoral muscles. Sorry, but this is certainly not natural selection. This is a planned creation act by someone with the knowledge and ability to try and change the original fish's makeup. Then other scientists looked at bony fish, like the zebrafish and the lungfish, and how in their muscles, their fin muscles, they grew similarly but differently from sharks. They believed they saw in the way the cells grew in the bony fish's muscles that it could be a middle step between muscle development in sharks and in some land animals. That difference is very important to scientists when they are trying to figure out how animals evolved, as apparently it supports the idea that land animals could have evolved from fish. My question though is, why rather than these differences being able to help the fish become human eventually, instead, why not consider how these differences support the idea that they are designed differently for the uniquely different kind of life these fish live within their aquatic waters? But what I've found really fascinating is this story surrounding their famous 80-million-year-old Tiktaalik rosé fish fossil, that according to evolutionists claim it has the necessary intermediate features clearly showing evolution between fish and tetrapods, which are four-footed animals. But then this happened. In 1938, scientists saw a coelacanth fish that had been caught by South African fishermen. To him, this was a normal, everyday fish, for his people had been catching that particular fish for centuries. The fish's iridescent blue colouring and its oddly fleshy fins that looked something like limbs fascinated the scientists. You see, scientists had seen fish like it before, but only as preserved fossils in ancient rocks. For the fish was identical to the Tiktaalik rosé fish fossil, which was supposed to have gone extinct over 18 million years ago. So here is this fish, alive and well today, yet it is exactly the same as the fish fossils that had helped scientists decide fish could become land dwellers and then way down the track to eventually become human. Now, did you find it as incredible as I did that this coelacanth fish is literally exactly the same as the fossilized fish? That means there has been absolutely no physical change at all in all of those 80 million years, and it is still living in the water. Now, if, according to the evolutionary timeline, it was 360 to 380 million years ago that fish first moved onto land, and in that time frame managed to become all sorts of different land animals, including eventually humans, then I don't know about you, but I reckon that is an awful lot of natural selection changes to happen. So surely in 80 million or so years, there would have been lots of natural selection changes in the fish that was caught. But you see, there is an even bigger quandary for evolutionists, because they have found footprints of a four-legged animal in a Polish quarry that, according to evolutionary time dating, is 397 million years old. Now, this makes these footprints at least 18 million years older than the Tiktaalik rosé fish fossil. As paleontologist Jennifer Clack rightly says, we have to rethink the whole thing. Evolutionists regularly claim walking fish like axolotls, handfish, mud skippers, etc., don't fit within the biblical creation account. Yet they ignore the proven fact that axolotls are only able to walk underwater. They can't walk on land, as they cannot breathe when they are out of water. And the other thing is that this is essential for the walking fish to be kept moist, for them to be able to remain on land for the very, very short time they come up out of the water. So my question is, why are we Christians ignoring the proven facts and in doing so limiting our God? Why can't we believe that our God is totally capable of creating all sorts of different kinds of fish, some of which can also move on land for a brief moment of time? Now, it might be helpful here to explain kinds as used in the creation account. There is more to it, but for now, a quick, simple explanation is that the Hebrew word min refers to two things that can breed together. So as a glaringly obvious example, whales and sharks don't breed together. After all, one is warm-blooded, mammal, and the other one is a cold-blooded fish. Whereas fin whales have been observed breeding with blue whales. It's not common, but it does happen. And when we look at the biblical account, do we hear God saying to any of the fish kinds, stop in the sea, you can go no further, no going up the land for you guys, like he did to the sea, where he went, you can go no further, you stop here. Not only that, nowhere do I see God saying that he only created a few limited kinds of fishy creatures that all sort of look and act alike. Like, have you ever stopped and thought or even queried about the fact that we have warm-blooded mammal fish like whales, dolphins and porpoises, who are certainly very different to the multitude of cold-blooded fish? And then thinking about it, as we are mammals, shouldn't evolutionists be looking at whales, dolphins and porpoises as our proposed fishy ancestors rather than cold-blooded fish? At least that would make it one less random change to worry about. Yes, we can be confident that God did create a vast variety of all sorts of fish kinds. If you ask me, it would be a pretty boring God with very limited ability if he only created a limited variety of sea creatures. Remember, the verse gives, let the waters teem with every living creature that swarms and creeps in the waters according to its kinds. But did you know that the Hebrew word for large sea creatures is sea dragons or monsters? Now, before we all burst out laughing at the idea of the Bible saying there are sea dragons or monsters in the ocean, because we all know they don't exist, I started to see that perhaps we need to stop and think again. Yes, we have been taught how these creatures are mythical, a figment of people's imagination. Yet seriously, thinking about it, why couldn't these large sea creatures be the aquatic dinosaurs? Why couldn't there be monsters in the past? I'm sure we are all well aware of how sea creatures are rapidly going extinct in today's world. In fact, sadly, there are less than 500 North Atlantic right whales left in the world, and it is believed they could become extinct within the next 30 years. And so to me, the more I research, the more I realize that when God says every living sea creature, he means literally every single kind, from those kinds that crawl along the bottom of the sea to those kinds that live in dark, deep, terrifying places. Think Finding Nemo. In fact, there is a 2014 article describing how the monster fish from Disney's 2003 Finding Nemo has finally been recorded on video for the first time. The article's headline describes it as Nemo's monster and nightmare-inducing. And it goes on to say this monster, while not large, is very real. Just in case you're interested, here is a picture of Finding Nemo's monster fish for you to have a good look at. That's pretty awesome, hey? So, learning about Nemo's monster fish got me questioning, and it made me curious. Why do we discount tales of monster sea serpents breaking up ships as myths just because we haven't seen them in the world today? Like in 100 years, who will have seen a North Atlantic right whale? Well, actually, I've never seen one. So why do we disbelieve sailors of the past? Why do we make them out to be simple, imaginative people who probably created these fanciful maps of the sea monsters to scare off the other sailors? Wouldn't you think it would be more logical to see that these sailors are creating maps which, when you look closely at them, actually include very detailed and accurate land drawings, and therefore wouldn't they also be showing the accurate whereabouts of their encounters with these ferocious dragons or sea monsters in their maps, in order to warn other sailors about the dangers to be encountered when they enter that area of the sea? Actually, if you think about it, really, they were well ahead of the times and were being health and safety conscious by creating maps to warn other sailors of the very real threat and danger to their lives if they sailed into this particular area of the sea. And believe me, if you go to Bing Images and you search for sea monsters on maps, you will find plenty of them to look at, with some of the details blown up for us to see better. But for now, let's look at just a couple of the maps. I recommend pausing each map so you can have a good long look at the detail in both maps. Or you could go to Bing Images. And I'm sure you noticed how the brown map has place names that we know. So this is not a work of fiction. And in the foreground, a very clear, detailed picture of a large sea dragon monster kind of thing in the sea. And did you look close enough so that you could see even the scales on his skin? And then in the second map's picture, did you notice how in the bottom left corner there is a detailed picture of a sea creature with people it has eaten in its stomach, and how the people on the boat are trying to kill it with a harpoon? Oh, it doesn't look like they will be successful. Certainly no figment of the imagination here. These sailors were drawing maps detailing what they had seen and experienced. Did you know that in 2018 there are around 34,000 recognised species of fish, and it is assumed that there is possibly many more hiding in the very depths of the ocean, hiding away like Nemo's monster fish? And of course, you know that some fish will have become extinct, just like the North Atlantic whale is likely to in the next 30 years. So I believe we can safely assume God created even more fish than what we know about now today. Just think about all those great sea monsters on the maps. Therefore, I reckon we can safely say that God created an immense variety of large sea creatures and small sea creatures. And guess what? The same can be said for birds. Now, a few years ago, the American Museum of Natural History realised they needed to undertake a new head count of birds, because they had discovered that some birds which look similar to one another or were thought to interbreed are actually totally different species. This new research revealed that there are around 18,000 bird species in the world, and that's nearly twice as many as they had previously thought. But even more problematic for evolutionists than working out whether around 9,000 birds who sort of look similar are actually not the same species, because after all, we know that ornithologists can and do spend lots of time performing the repeated observation experiments necessary to make an informed scientific decision. And of course, that's what they did. They were able to spend plenty of time viewing and studying these birds living and doing what comes naturally, to find out whether they do or don't interbreed, which helped them realize where they needed to make adjustments to their previous thinking as to what bird belongs to what species. But problems arise when it comes to trying to work out the evolutionary timeline of birds. You see, they have come across many hurdles, mainly because they are usually working with partial skeleton fossils, which, needless to say, are very dead and can't talk to tell them how they really looked or how they ate and behaved, etc., while they were alive. Therefore, these scientists have to make assumptions and use their imagination based on the behaviour of today's birds to come up with an evolutionary timeline that shows how birds evolved. Now, while trying to work through their various theories and their counter theories and their doublespeak to find some sort of cohesive argument, honestly, it did my head in. Now, as a quick overview of what I read, starting in 1868, Thomas Huxley, as part of his aggressive promotion of evolution, suggested birds evolved from dinosaurs. Then in the early 1900s, paleontologists realised dinosaurs have evolved far too many specific, complex features for birds to have evolved from dinosaurs. So then, some scientists decided that instead birds evolved from reptiles, possibly either a crocodile-like animal or a flying reptiles like the pterosaurs. Now, to me, the pterosaurs did seem to make much more sense. After all, they had wings, and so they could fly. Less changes. Fast forward to 1980, and once again, dinosaurs were the favoured ancestor of birds due to the Chinese discovery of dinosaur fossils that had looked like they had feathers. An ornithologist, Alan Fedosia, whose work primarily focuses on evolutionary biology, along with other evolutionary experts, analysed the claims of these feathered dinosaurs from China in some detail. And they found, from experimental as well as the fossil evidence, that the fibres found on the outside of the skeleton of the Sinosauropteryx and others are better explained as collagen fibres that were simply a part of the skin of the dinosaur. Wait, for then a new and seemingly more plausible discovery came along, the theropod Deinonychus. What I found bizarre is how that despite the fact that the Deinonychus had so many features that were not at all bird-like, and yet it is still the theoretical choice for many scientists to be the dinosaur ancestor of birds. Then there were other scientists who proposed that the theropod dinosaurs like the Troodon, who are more similar to birds than the Deinonychus, should be the bird's original evolutionary ancestor. But to me, there is still a really unsurmountable problem with this dinosaur theory for the origin of birds. You see, when looking at all the fossil evidence, they have discovered that nearly all of the bird-like theropod dinosaurs actually appeared later in the evolutionary timeline than the first bird fossil. I don't know about you, but how can the dinosaurs that they claim to be the ancestors of birds be found in rocks that, according to their evolutionary thinking, are younger than its supposed bird descendants? Now, another problem evolutionists have in sticking to this theory is that paleontologists have discovered millions of fossilised bird tracks running right alongside dinosaur foot tracks in many parts of the world. Wouldn't you think that logically, looking at this evidence, that they should realise this is proof that birds and dinosaurs actually live together and consequently makes null and void their birds evolved from dinosaurs theory? Nope. Their solution was to devise the reverse scenario where some dinosaur species may have descended from birds. What are they thinking? Those tracks still tell a different story. Surely those tracks are saying loud and clear birds and dinosaurs lived at the same time. Ultimately, we see that they still haven't solved their problem of what exactly did birds originally evolve from. As evolutionist Professor Lawrence Whitmer noted, some theories about bird evolution came and went quickly. No kidding! My head was spinning like a wheel, and I have only covered a fraction of the theories. And all this makes me wonder, how does God feel about all these imaginative scenarios that keep needing to be adjusted all the time and still come up with no positive proof that the new theory is the correct theory? And Professor Whitmer is closer to the truth than he realizes when he said that we will probably never be lucky enough to find the fossils of the true ancestor of birds. But then, like earlier in the creation series, where we had some theories about the beginning of the universe that affirmed the biblical account, there is this theory regarding birds that, aside from its evolutionary super long time period, where with enough imagination there could be a long enough time for things to be able to make all those incredibly massive random changes. And yet, despite that long age of stuff, this theory is actually very close to affirming the biblical account regarding the creation of birds. And as some scientists explain, the lack of fossil evidence for bird evolution as being due to an avian evolutionary explosion that produced all the living orders within a short time frame. Yep, once again, this sounds like the biblical account to me. Now, before we discuss the next point about birds, let's take a look at the silly red herring question that many people ask concerning the creation of birds. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Firstly, shouldn't that question also be directed to all birds, crocodiles and turtles, etc., as they all come from eggs? My answer is, the grown animal came first. Oh, duh. Hey, but just don't take my word for it. For you see, in 2010, Dr. Colin Freeman reported, it has long been suspected that the egg came first, but now there is scientific proof that shows that in fact the chicken came first, as the vital protein to kickstart egg formation is found only in a chicken. So you see, God not only created birds who would fly and lay eggs up high, or not be able to fly and so lay their eggs on the ground or bury them in the ground according to their kind. You see, God also created another very special kind of bird with a very special purpose. Chickens, who would be ready to begin laying eggs the very next day, which would then provide good, nutritious food for what he would be creating the next day. But you see, what I can't understand is, if birds evolved from something else yet to be decided and somehow randomly developed into around 18,000 different species, why is it the chickens are the only bird that lays eggs daily? Well, actually, it's approximately 6 times a week. I don't know about you, but I find it interesting how all birds living in the wild need a male for them to be able to produce any eggs at all. Their eggs are to create more birds like them. Therefore, they are obeying God's command to be fruitful and multiply on the earth. And yes, some wild birds, like parakeets and parrots, etc., if they are kept as a domestic pet, will lay eggs without a mate. But you see, that is because their situation is mimicking the ideal conditions for egg laying in the wild. They have plenty of food. They have a place to make a safe nest. And they have a pseudo male, which could be their reflection in a mirror, or their person who fusses over them a lot and scratching and preening them, like a mate would in the wild. So yes, then they will lay eggs. Naturally, those eggs will not become birds. Whereas chickens don't need a pseudo rooster to produce eggs. They just keep popping them out, eggs after day, doing what they are designed for, to be a really good food source for the people God is creating the next day. What we Christians need to realize is that when God was creating the world and everything in it, He was creating all that with His final creation in mind, us. I hope you are beginning to see how Genesis does not teach us that God created species that are limited and fixed. Rather, Genesis shows us a God who created a fixity of kinds. In other words, sharks are sharks and don't even breed with other cold-blooded fish, let alone fish that are mammals. And birds may, as ornithologists discovered, look very similar, but they are only able to breed within their own kind. I believe God is showing us in Genesis that He thinks it is vitally important for people to understand how our God is certainly powerful enough to be quite capable of creating a multitude of unique kinds of fish and birds in a very short time frame. Now, if we take time to stop and think about the mathematical probability of around the 390,900 different kinds of plants we talked about last time, plus 34,000 recognized species of fish, along with 18,000 recognized species of birds, all randomly acquiring their own specific arrangements of subunits and their own specific arrangements of amino acids to make the essential functional proteins, enzymes, and specific arrangements of nucleic acid bases to make the specific functional DNA and RNA necessary to enable them to function as individual species is, as evolutionist Fred Hoyle states, this is a problem, as the chance of obtaining about 2,000 enzymes in a random trial is only 1 part in 10 over 40,000, an outrageously small probability that could not be faced even if the whole universe consisted of organic soup. I'm sorry, but the mathematical probability of all of that is way beyond me to figure out. It is so ginormous to the point of being miraculous. If you can work it out, let me know. And then we find astrobiologist Paul Davies saying, it is the software of the living cell that is the real mystery, not the hardware. How did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? Nobody knows. But can I hear you thinking, okay, yeah, but you still haven't answered the question, how does the Bible say God did it? I haven't seen it anywhere in those first 3 chapters. Just how did God create? If, as you say, He didn't use evolution's long ages. Fair enough. So let us take a look at what the Bible really does say about how God created. Perhaps if you stop and think about the creation narrative for a moment, can you think of a constant refrain throughout the narrative that shows us how God created? To help you think, I have dropped clues throughout the previous messages. Okay, go to the top of the class if you thought, then God said, let there be. That is the clue. God, by the very power of His word, which as we learn is Jesus, who just spoke and commanded what God had decreed into existence. And bam, the Holy Spirit made it happen instantly. There is no long billions of years process mentioned. Now, as we Christians are supposed to believe God doesn't lie, and with each sermon I am becoming more positive that he doesn't. Now, if God doesn't lie, then surely he would have told the truth and had Genesis tell us how he took billions of years in his narrative? No. What we read is that it was by God speaking and commanding things into existence, and bam, it instantly happened. Really, we just need to review today's verses and see what it says. Then God said, let the water swarm with living creatures. And then God said, let birds fly above the earth, across the expanse of the sky. And that is how God informs us how creation happened. As Christians, shouldn't we be believing God knows what he is talking about and that he is not lying to us? When we started this creation sermon series, as I said, I boldly claimed I knew my God was a big God who could create in 6 literal days. And as I said earlier, every single time I write a sermon, sadly, I am discovering just how much the theory of evolution has actually influenced my thinking to the point it has given me a very small and pathetic understanding of our God. Really, my God was not so big after all. But fortunately, now my God is getting bigger all the time. Now he is so big and powerful that he can just speak and command, and it will happen in an instant. His spoken word has the power to create the universe, the earth, a myriad of sea creatures and birds, and the creation work still to follow on the next day. And so I pray that the Holy Spirit is helping you see the need to double check whether God is telling the truth in Genesis, so that your understanding of God's work in creation will increase and your knowledge of God will grow. And I pray that now you are beginning to see just how big and amazing our God, through his creation, truly is. Amen.